We believe in the power of ideas to solve big, difficult problems and to transform people and planet. Africa's tech startups are just getting started. Introducing Timbuktoo, the largest initiative in the world to support the African innovation ecosystem, bringing together public and private partners and bridging catalytic and commercial capital. Timbuktoo will invest $1 billion to address gaps in early stage risk capital, to get the ecosystem right, and to capture the Pan-African opportunity. Timbuktoo's 8 privately managed hubs will each focus on a different priority and will attract top African talent from across the continent. In each hub, a startup builder will nurture investment-ready startups, while a commercial venture fund will invest in early-stage startups. Timbuktoo is sparkling Africa's startup revolution. Timbuktoo is forging the new African venture capital, more inclusive, Pan-African, and ecosystem-minded. Are you in?
Thank you, everyone. Good morning. Delighted to be here to discuss the new African venture capital and our Timbuktoo initiative, which I lead at UNDP Africa. We have an incredible panel made up of superstars in the African tech ecosystem, and we are going to actually also have an exciting announcement as we close off this session. So to kick off into our discussion, thank you so much for joining us. I'm going to start with Courtney, who is the, as you know, the managing partner and COO of 500 Global, formerly 500 Startups, which has $3 billion assets under management, has supported 50 unicorns across the world in the last 13 years, investing in 81 countries, and has recently, including one unicorn out of Africa, Chipper Cash, and is now really moving into Africa. So I want to ask you, Courtney, based on 500's major role in galvanizing innovation and startups as a global giant, as we've just said, what is your vision for 500 Global in Africa? And how do you see the role of catalytic blended finance in what you do?
Yes, it's an incredible time to be investing in Africa, as there's so much talent among the youth population, and there's already been incredible startups created, as we have done by some of our panelists here today. So I think when we're thinking about developing a nascent or emerging startup ecosystem, it's really important to have many stakeholders involved in seeing the ecosystem accelerate as fast as possible. And from our vantage point, having invested in so many ecosystems around the world, that requires a strong partnership between catalytic capital, government support, corporate support, and more financially driven investors like ourselves. So in order to really escalate the timeline, it's important that stakeholders work together in a really unified fashion to move an ecosystem forward as quickly as possible.
Fantastic, fantastic. I'm going to switch over to E, because E, I describe 500 as a giant, global giant in the tech ecosystem, and E is a personal, individual giant in the tech ecosystem as the co-founder of not just one, but 2 unicorns, Andela and then Flutterwave, and he's now a founder investor in a new venture called Future Africa, which itself is on the way to nurturing, I think it's Move, you told me, the company that's on its way to unicorn status. So really the question for you, E, is how do you see where venture capital in Africa is going? And how do you see the role of first of all, how is it different than elsewhere? And what do governments need to do and need to do better, in your opinion, as you're in this space?
Absolutely. The reality of venture capital is that venture capital is intended to enable innovators and entrepreneurs to be able to build scalable solutions to society's problems. When you look at how venture capital evolved in the US to become a powerful R&D and commercialization machine that delivered to us all the technology, quite literally in this room, from your Apple computers to your lights to your cameras, you see the power of venture capital. In Africa, you know, we are currently on the halfway mark to the Sustainable Development Goals. And we've made so little progress. That's the reality. We are at 15%. And the reality is that if we're going to have any hope of hitting the goals over the next 7 years, we're going to need to put some catalytic capital to work. But the way we've often done it, unfortunately, we do it in a bunch of silos. We do it, you know, in a non-structured manner that doesn't actually interrelate. And so we don't have the handoffs that are required to create scale at a large level. And that's why I'm really excited about what Timbuktoo is doing. Because for the first time, we're actually coming to the market to say, here's $1 billion. Can we find innovators that can solve some of our biggest problems so that, you know, we can find companies? And one of the things I just want to point out is that, you know, people would say 10 years ago that you can't deploy $1 billion in Africa the way Timbuktoo is planning to. But the reality of what is happening today is that over the last 10 years, we've more than proven that it is possible to deploy and return capital in Africa at that scale. Future Africa has funded over 100 companies. We've raised $1 billion in follow-on capital. The combined value of all the companies that we funded is $6 billion. In 2022, wow. The markets in Africa raised $5 billion. So the ecosystem has really matured. So $1 billion is really a drop in the bucket. And that's why I think it's really important that we actually look at this as an opportunity. The world looks at this as an opportunity for them to be part of what is likely to be the last wave of economic development and prosperity via venture capital in the world.
Awesome, thank you. You know, we talk about the huge gap in early stage risk capital, and obviously we're all focused on that. And there is an entity that sort of is a big player that's a little bit unrecognized when we talk about venture capital, which are business angels, angel investors, as the first movers ahead of institutional venture capital. So angel investors have a tremendous role to play, and yet we really are only at the very, very, very beginning of what the power of angel investing can do. And I'm curious, Fadila, as the Secretary General of ABAN, the African Business Angels Network, which is a network of about 80, how many? 69 angel networks around the continent, and you've been actively promoting and educating the ecosystem on the power and importance of risk capital coming from angel investing. How do you see you know, the experience with combining angel investing with catalytic capital? Because I think that's the other thing, and actually you are not only the Secretary General of ABAN, but you're also the fund manager for Catalytic Africa. So it'd be great to hear that synergy between the two.
Yeah, thank you very much, Eleni. I think, I mean, what we have observed so far is that angel investors and angel investing on the continent is a very significant aspect in driving the startup ecosystem. And so far, the success stories that we have observed on the continent, including Andela, has been seen and appreciated because of the contribution that we from the angel investors. So I would say that with time, the angel investors themselves will have gained experience, they are more disciplined, and they appreciate the risk that is pretty much around the whole continent. And I think it's because of the involvement in pushing startup by financing those startups, but most importantly by providing mentorship, that we thought about creating Catalytic Africa, which is a solution to de-risk their investment. And so far last year, with the $5 billion that was attracted by startup on the continent, you see that we have about $400 million contribution from angel investors. Now, with Catalytic Africa, we are even creating more incentive for angel investors to continue investing on the continent. And today, we can tell you that Africans want to co-own the empires of the future. And with the launch of Catalytic Africa, we have so far deployed capital in more than 14 African countries. and we have invested in more than 18 startups on the continent. And of course, this is a testament to the ability of these individuals that are emerging as angel investors on the continent who want to co-own these empires and who understand the value creation that they are providing for the continent. And I am more than happy to say that Africans, angel investors, are pushing it, and they want to be part of the party. And we have seen the results so far. We're just going to continue doing so by making sure that other stakeholders are involved in our mission towards using angel investing as an economic development tool. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So at Timbuktoo, we talk about forging the new African venture capital. And what we mean by that is if we look at the current, and you talked about the $5 billion number that we all got excited about last year, $5 billion coming into VC, into Africa, 250% growth year on year, the fastest growing region in the world for venture capital. But if you dig a little bit deeper, what you see is that 89% of that capital came from outside, 83% went to only 4 countries, 60% on average roughly went into one sector, fintech. So what we talk about when we talk about the new African venture capital is capital that is more inclusive, that is more ecosystem-minded in terms of solving some of the pieces of the puzzle that are missing, the links to corporates, the links to university, R&D, and knowledge centers, really bringing together also policy to bear on this Africa-wide ecosystem. And then finally also capturing the Pan-African opportunity. So we're super excited about Timbuktoo, and we've been talking to you, all 3, about how we can work with you to really forge this new African venture capital. So let me go back to Courtney and start with really thinking with 500, how do you see Timbuktoo enhancing your Africa strategy? How do you see leverage possibilities and opportunities?
Yeah, so I think you said it really well. When you're thinking about developing an ecosystem, there's really several critical factors that have to come into play. It's not just the amount of capital being invested. Unfortunately, it's not just the talent that exists. It also has to be really critical policy development work that takes place and education for investors and all sorts of stakeholders. So I think the opportunity that I see for Timbuktoo is to really play the role of being a very cohesive movement, to be able to not only educate founders, but also to be able to provide the really intense focus on certain sectors that are going to be interesting from a venture investor standpoint. And then I think it's also critical that it is a Pan-African strategy. So you're seeing the development of multiple countries across Africa and moving them into the venture ecosystem, into the startup ecosystem in a strong way. And then very critically, you are very focused on being able to work directly with the government, with the UNDP, and these are such critical stakeholders in order to see an ecosystem move forward. I think people often forget that in Silicon Valley, it took 50 years of direct government intervention to really see the venture ecosystem come alive. So we're in the nascency of this.
50 or
50. 50 years, that's right. So we are really in the early stages of development across the African continent, and it will take many stakeholders such as Timbuktoo really forging the way to see this happen.
Excellent, excellent. We were talking yesterday about your categorization of ecosystems from, I think it was from nascent to emerging to, what was the third one?
So we categorize the development of each ecosystem as nascent, emerging, or advanced. And we've applied this framework across countries all around the world. And on average, we've seen it take about 15 years for an ecosystem to move from nascent to emerging. And that's once you have very directed government intervention.
So we hope that we're going to take Africa from where you think maybe it's nascent or emerging now?
I think primarily it's nascent, but I do think you have pockets where you could certainly characterize things as more emerging, and primarily in the 4 countries that that have received a lot of the capital. So we hope to see that.
All right.
Further.
So to nascent, from nascent to emerging, So Fadila, to you, how do you see Timbuktoo enhancing and working with what you're trying to achieve?
Well, I think Timbuktoo is coming at a very interesting time for the continent. especially given the fact that angel investors have essentially have a skin in the game on the continent, and that skin in the game is spread. It's no longer about South Africa, Egypt, Nigeria, and Kenya, but now we're talking also about Rwanda, we're talking about DRC, we're talking about Cameroon, we're talking about Senegal. And having this spread across the continent, it means that Timbuktoo can spread its wing and provide additional capital that would be much needed to all these companies that would be emerging or that are already emerging in these countries, which will be, of course, very important in helping them succeed in their journey. And this is what I see happening very soon, actually.
Thank you, thank you. Thank you so much. Over to you, E.
Yeah, I think for me, it's really about building an ecosystem. And it's something we talk about a lot, but rarely see done on a Pan-African level and at incredible scale. And what I'm looking at is how do we build an innovation ecosystem that can actually solve our problems? Not just, be nice for, the headlines, or nice for Silicon Valley returns, or nice for a few founders who get lucky enough to get backed, but really something that funds innovation and products that has a real impact on the lives of people and gets us closer to the goals.
Awesome. And I always tell people, and I'm not saying this because you're here and we definitely didn't talk about this, but I always tell people, what if we could build a Pan-African innovation ecosystem so that we didn't just have 5 or 6 E's, we had hundreds in tens of countries, and we really saw Africa transform. So thank you so much, the 3 of you. We can't do it without you. I think you heard it on the video, but let me repeat it again. Timbuktoo is not a UNDP managed project. It's going to sit squarely on the continent, managed by private partners such as yourselves. So we will be looking to you and others to really get this off the ground. And it will take the will of governments, and we'll soon be hearing from a government representative from Rwanda. But really it is a multi-partner, multi-country ecosystem play, and we're so excited that we're going to march forward with all of you. Thank you so much.